Welcome back. Today, we go through a stillness journey. A journey Carl Jung said begins when you stop expressing your emotions and everything starts to transform. There is a moment that all of us will face. The moment there was nothing left to say, nothing left to prove, nothing left to react to hastily. Not because we no longer have emotions, but because inside us a very different kind of stillness begins to appear. Not the silence of a tired person, not the silence of the disappointed. It is the silence of a body that is gradually waking up. Maybe you've never named it, but you felt it every time your heart lets out a sigh when your mind stops arguing. When a deep part of you whispers just to stay still. Carl Jung called it the beginning of the process of individuation. When the ego stops responding to what the world wants and starts listening to the voice of the self. It is not an action, but a state, a silent return. Throughout our lives, we are taught how to react in order to survive. From a young age, reacting is the only way we can be seen, loved, and accepted. Every tear is comforted. Every obedience is rewarded. And gradually, we learn not only to react, but to identify ourselves with that reaction. We believe that we must do something immediately to survive in the eyes of others. We forget that it is in the pause that the being begins to speak. Perhaps you have lived your whole life as a shadow of expectations. React so as not to be abandoned. React so as not to be judged. React so as not to have to look at your own emptiness. But that gap is not a shortage. It is the door. And that door opens not by adding any effort, but by stopping. In that silence, you may realize something very true. You've been reacting all your life without ever really choosing. Every explanation is an attempt to be understood. Every resistance is a fear of being viewed wrongly.
Every time we express our emotions, sometimes it's not because we want to share, but because we don't know how to stay with ourselves in silence. Freedom begins not with how we express ourselves, but with our ability to be present with ourselves in the moments when we don't need to do anything. Carl Jung once wrote, "Silence is where the ego falls so that the being can speak." When you no longer have to prove anything, you begin to tap into something deeper than any reaction, yourself. And like every true journey, the first thing is not to act, but to listen. Not listening to anyone else, but listening to the whispers that have been buried by so many layers of reflexes, so many habits of pleasing, so many times we nodded, even though we were trembling inside. That whisper says there is no need to respond, just listen, because all the answers are already in this stillness. Imagine you are an office worker in New York or Berlin. As soon as I left my desk, my phone vibrated continuously. Emails from the boss, messages from the group, social network notifications. You don't really want to answer, but in your head it says, if I don't respond right away, they will think I'm lazy, unprofessional, and indifferent. And so you answer, not because you choose to, but because you're afraid. It's no longer communication. It's a survival reflex. The reaction now is no longer an expression of freedom, but the result of fear of exclusion, what Carl Jung called psychological darkness. The primal fear that if we do not please the world, we will be forgotten. In modern society, where everything is measured by response speed and presence, stopping suddenly becomes an act of silent protest. But it is in that action that the being begins to regain its central position. The price of predictability. There is something strange about human psychology. We often think we are loved because we are always there, always on time, always answerable, always trying to do the right thing.
But the more accessible we are, the more we are taken for granted. The more predictable we are, the more invisible we become. Not because your value is less, but because others no longer need to make an effort to keep what is always available. Predictability started out as a lauded quality. An obedient child knows how to obey and say yes when called. Mature people know how to do the right thing, know how to organize, and know how to sacrifice. But at a certain point,
Between effort and willingness, the boundary gradually disappears. I have become something that can be relied upon in the eyes of others. But in my own eyes, I gradually became someone who couldn't retreat, couldn't say I couldn't disappear, even for a moment to breathe. Carl Jung once warned, "What we appear to others is only a small part of what we really are. When we live forever in that role, we forget the rest, the wildest, truest, and freest part of ourselves." Predictability is the mask we wear to be loved and kept. But that mask not only hides, it drains. Every time we respond to something that is not sincere, a part of ourselves is stripped away, and we begin to feel tired. The fatigue does not come from the body, but from the mind. No one sees me fall because I look fine on the outside. No one knew I was exhausted because my words remained steady. But inside, something is dying. A silent kind of exhaustion. Without sound, without blood flowing, but draining every drop of vital energy. Because we no longer live in the zone of choice, but in the zone of reaction. Have you ever wondered why you feel compelled to respond to messages even when exhausted? Why do you feel nervous if you don't respond to a random text message? Why are you afraid of disappointing others, even when it causes you to abandon yourself? The answer is often not in the present. It lies deeper, where your ego has learned that only when you are present can you be accepted.
And from there, you become a person who is more present for others than for yourself. But you know what? Not everyone deserves your presence. Not every word needs a response. Not every relationship needs saving. Overavailability is a form synonymous with self-forgetfulness. You gradually become another person's emotional tool, the place they come to when they need to vent, when they need to be filled, when they need to be understood. But when you are weak, they stay silent. When you need to be heard, they turn away. Carl Jung called this phenomenon an energy shift, where our being is no longer the coordinating center, but becomes a container for energy flows coming from the outside. And that makes us distance ourselves from ourselves in an invisible but cruel way. Try observing. You feel empty after each reluctant nod. You feel tired after every conversation that you don't really want to participate in. You used to laugh and replied that it's okay, while deep down is a sigh. Those things are not small. They are microscopic scratches on your psychological defenses. They don't hurt right away, but over time, they wear away. And you'd call it calloused. But you don't have to become calloused. You just need to become selective. You were not born to be a symbol of unconditional service. You were born to discover who you are. And that requires you to hold back the deepest, quietest, even most obscure parts of yourself. Because sometimes, the very things that make you unpredictable are the things that keep your being intact. There are roles in life we never agreed to take on, but we still wear them and live each day as if they were us. No one forced, no one told. But from a very early age, we learn that only when we have little will we be loved. Carl Jung called it persona, the psychological mask we wear to adapt to society, to be recognized, not to be excluded. It is not a deception. It is a survival mechanism. But the problem is that when we identify too much with that mask, the true self begins to recede and disappear. Have you ever smiled while inside you just wanted to cry? Have you ever been somewhere not because you wanted to, but because you were afraid of being judged for your absence? You replied to a message at the wrong time just because you didn't want others to misunderstand. We do not lack presence. We lack a true reason to be present. Every time we say we are present but not present with ourselves, we stand one step further away from ourselves, and we no longer know which role is ours and which is us. Presence at that time was no longer a gift, but became a burden. We no longer enter the relationship with integrity, but to maintain an image, an expected image, a cute, understanding, patient, tolerant, and correct image. But the being cannot live in an image. It needs to breathe. It needs to be collected. It needs to be absent. It needs to be free from being useful in every moment. Jung once wrote, "True harmony with another cannot come from one persona. It can only happen when two beings touch each other, without defensiveness, without straining, without trying to be right." If you always appear in a way that makes others feel comfortable, chances are you're not being comfortable yourself. Because every time you reassure others, you trade a part of your truth to buy a moment of safety. If your presence is not easily rooted from within, it will soon be hindered. And when you run out, you will find yourself like a smiling shadow, present without really being present. We often confuse presence and tolerance, but true presence doesn't come from always being there. It comes from where you choose to be, by being conscious, by being whole, not trying to fit in. You have the right to withdraw. You have the right not to respond immediately. You have the right to be absent from every conversation, every expectation, every comfort zone that others draw for you. No one can live a real life if they have to wear a smile every day. No one can listen to their own being if they always have to be present where others need them. Retreat is not protest. It is a gesture of self-awareness. It says, I know where I am. I know what's going on inside me. And I choose to stay who I am instead of falling apart to please everyone. It is when you are absent from the world that you can be present in being. And when your being is restored, you no longer need to be everywhere, all the time, to be loved. Because real love doesn't need you to act. It just needs you to be real. There are days when you don't do much and still feel exhausted. Not because of work, not because of time, but because something inside is continuously flowing like a stream that is silently drilled, drop by drop. Carl Jung called it psychological energy, an invisible but limited resource. And like any resource, if you don't know how to preserve it, sooner or later it will run out. We often think of energy as something we use to act, to work, to solve problems, to communicate with others. But few people stop to realize that every emotion, every thought, every reaction consumes a part of life energy. When you react hastily to an idle comment, when you argue just to prove yourself right, when you struggle to keep the peace in a relationship that is broken from the inside, you are not only wasting time, you are wasting yourself. Each time, a part of your being is extracted to feed things that do not nourish you. And so the day passed. You couldn't name why you were tired, but you knew clearly that somewhere inside you were exhausted. We are taught how to handle situations, but are rarely shown how to protect our energy. Because of that, the outside world only sees behavior, but the inner world that really determines your child's life is seen as a wild forest. Jung did not see the human mind as a machine that could work forever. He saw it as an energy system, where everything operates on the principle of exchange. You give, you lose. You keep, you remain. No energy is free. And the most dangerous thing is when you give without knowing that you are giving. You give others your emotional stability when they are unstable. You give away your quiet time to fill their void. You give away your inner voice just to listen and respond to needs coming from the outside. At some point, you can no longer hear yourself. Not because it was silent, but because it was drowned out by the noise of the world. And when you can no longer distinguish between yourself and just a reaction, you fall into the scariest state: exhaustion, for no apparent reason. What Jung called psychological energy is today also described by many modern psychologists in terms of our nervous system. The state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fight, flee, freeze, or please. Every time you rush to react, you are activating one of those 4 survival mechanisms. When you argue to the end, you are fighting. When you dodge, you are running away. When you stay silent in paralysis, you are freezing. And when you try to please to keep the peace, you are fawning, sacrificing yourself for a sense of security. But when you start learning to stop, to not react immediately, you are sending a new signal to your nervous system. I no longer need to fight or please to stay safe. This is where Jung's philosophy meets modern psychology. Transformation does not just come from consciousness, but begins with the body itself, from relearning how to be at peace within yourself. We often think of exhaustion as a sign of overwork, but for many people, the deepest fatigue comes from overreacting. In the mind, in the emotions, in the unconscious. It's not the job that gets you down. It's the silent stress of always having to be present, explain, adjust, and please. Carl Jung once wrote, "What you resist will continue to exist." Every time you react, you're not just pushing energy out. You're tying yourself to the very thing you want to avoid. Let's try to imagine. If each judgment is just like an arrow, then your reaction is the string that holds it in your heart. The more you react, the more it stays. The more silent you are, the more it passes. Psychological energy should therefore not be used to fight everything. It should be reserved for things that are worthy of touching your being. You don't have to be everywhere. You don't have to explain your silence every time. You don't have to stay predictable to make others feel comfortable. You were not born to be an emotional broadcasting station for the world. You were born to be your own center of consciousness. If you find yourself always reacting too quickly, try a little exercise. Step 1. Pause for 10 seconds. When you receive a text or comment that upsets you, count slowly from 1 to 10. Place your hand on your chest and just observe the rising emotions. Step 2. Ask a question. Do I want to answer because I really want to, or just because I'm afraid of being misunderstood or hated? Step 3. Choose slow response. If you're not clear, give yourself the right to say, "I need some time to think. I'll get back to you later." Intentional silence is also an answer. Every time you practice stopping like this, you are not only conserving your energy, but you are also exercising the muscle of inner self-control. You're teaching the body that safety doesn't come from reacting, but from the ability to stay with yourself in stillness. And the first thing you need to relearn is the art of conserving energy. Stay silent, knowing that reacting will only hurt you further. Stay present for the places that nourish you, not destroy you. Keep clear about what is drawing you away and what is helping you grow. Because ultimately, you can't reach your true self if you don't have enough energy left to stand firmly in your own mind. If you're still watching and find these lessons really helpful, leave a comment saying,
I like this video, so we know you're with us. This is not only a way to show support, but also a great source of encouragement for us to continue creating more useful and meaningful content. Thank you for always being there and supporting. Join Thinkers Insights to follow the next content. We are often afraid of silence, not because it is dangerous, but because it makes us face ourselves. There was nothing left to cover, no one left to blame, no movement loud enough to cover up the sigh inside. But what few people are taught is that silence is not a void. Silence is a space of transformation. When you stop reacting, the first thing that appears is not peace, but turmoil. It's as if you've just unplugged a machine that's been used to running continuously for years. Every noise in my mind began to sound clearer. The questions you used to avoid come back, patiently, quietly, but with weight. It's not a bug, it's a phase. Carl Jung once wrote, "Whoever looks outside dreams, whoever looks inside wakes up." Silence is the act of turning inside, and in that space, you begin to hear things that have never been said out loud. Questions like, why do we always need to respond quickly? Why do you feel guilty about staying silent? What are we holding on to in conversations that aren't nurturing? When you no longer have to react, you have the opportunity to observe. And in that observation, you see repetitive patterns, psychological games, old reflexes, very old fears. Everything appears clearly, without the lens of defense. At that moment, silence was no longer a scary emptiness. It becomes a fertile ground where the unconscious begins to emerge. Not to scare you, but to be seen, to be heard, to be transformed. People who are easily manipulated by other people's emotions are often people who have never been taught how to stand still within themselves.
But once you touch the stability of silence, you will realize you no longer need to say anything to affirm that you are alive. No need to react to prove you are right. No need to be everywhere to prove you are worthy. Because you have begun to enter a state of unconditional existence. No longer dependent on roles, no longer dependent on anyone's gaze. Jung called it a form of rebirth from within. Not a loud, dramatic rebirth, but a subtle recovery, where consciousness and being silently meet again in silence. You will begin to clearly see that there are relationships that only exist because you always respond. There are feelings that only last because you have never dared to stay silent. There are conflicts that only live because you continue to pour your energy into them. And then, when you stop, all of those things start to fall. Not because you avoid it, but because you stop nurturing what is no longer real. The silence then became a silent declaration. I choose my being. I no longer live as a reflection of the world. I am willing to be present without having to speak. This is not something you can explain to everyone, and you don't need to. Because when you start living in silence, your silence is the answer. There is a type of fatigue that does not come from what you do, but from what you feel. Even though many times that feeling does not entirely belong to you. That's when you're sad without knowing why. Worried without a specific reason. Angry without knowing what really touched you. In moments like that, you are most likely living on other people's emotions. Carl Jung once said that we are not so much affected by what happens as by what is not yet consciously controlled. And one of the deepest unconscious levels is that we let other people's emotions determine our inner state. Have you ever felt anxious just because someone was quiet? Ever lost your temper because someone didn't respond as you expected?
Have you ever forced yourself to appear happy just because you were afraid the atmosphere would become heavy if you lived true to your inner feelings? At those times, you are no longer the center of directing your own emotions. You become a reflection of someone else, a mirror distorted by expectations, dependence, and the belief that you are responsible for someone else's state. But we are not born to be controlled by our gaze, nor are we born to become someone's emotional switch, turning it on when they need to be happy, turning it off when they are angry. However, we learn from a very early age that the peace of the outside world determines the feeling of security within. So we try to keep things calm by forgetting ourselves. Gradually, people around also got used to it. They know that you will always answer, always understand, always be there. And when you're no longer like that, they're confused, they're angry, they blame. But their reaction is not proof that you are wrong. It is just the result of a control mechanism that has been disrupted. Jung does not teach us to turn against others. He invites us to observe what is happening in silence. The expectant eyes, the pressured silences, the roundabout words that make you have to explain, have to calm down, have to return to normal as they want. These are invisible manipulation techniques, not always intentional, but almost always effective. Why? Because you have allowed them to happen. And when something is allowed too many times, it suddenly becomes a habit. For others in your own emotional territory. But there's one important thing. No one can manipulate you if you don't react. When you stop responding immediately, when you choose silence instead of explanation, when you relax instead of defending, you are not weaker. On the contrary, you are doing one of the most powerful things a human being can do, reestablishing boundaries. Not with strong statements, not with anger, but with a selective presence, by no longer letting your mind be manipulated, by deciding to return to your true self, a place where no one but you has the right to decide. Cutting off emotional manipulation is not a declaration of war, but a quiet refusal. A refusal to react according to the old script. A refusal to be adjusted like a switch. A refusal to trade peace for a false acceptance. And when you start doing that, you'll see some people withdraw. Some people criticize. Some people say you've changed. But in return, you have yourself back. You stand firmer, breathe deeper, and live with more clarity. You stop wondering what to do and start choosing what you really want to do. That is true self-control. Not the ability to control others, but the ability to no longer let other people's emotions dictate your life. There will come a moment in life, without warning, without easy naming, when you suddenly realize that you no longer belong to the places that were once very familiar. Relationships that were once central gradually broke down. Roles that once made you proud suddenly feel empty. And the noises from outside no longer seem to touch your heart. Many people call it getting lost. But Jung called it the beginning of the process of individuation. There was no bell to signal this journey, nor was there anyone standing there to show the way. It rarely begins with a clear choice, but often begins with a crack, a feeling of rupture in everyday life, a deep fatigue that no amount of sleep can cure. A call, very small, but strong enough to make you stop. What is personalization? Jung defined it as the psychological process in which a person gradually becomes himself, complete, original, not repeating anyone, not determined by social roles. In other words, it's the journey where you stop living as someone else's shadow and start living as a full whole, with both your own light and your own darkness. What few people tell you is, individualization does not begin with sublimation, but begins with falling. You fall out of communities that are no longer relevant,
Fall away from the ways of thinking that once protected you, falling from the image you worked so hard to build. And then you enter a space that Jung called sacred isolation. That isolation is unlike any form of loneliness you have ever experienced. It doesn't come from being abandoned, but from the fact that you no longer want to keep what is no longer you. You can still live in the world, go to work, meet, talk, but inside you have entered a private realm where all outside voices gradually fade away and you begin to hear a different breathing rhythm, the breathing of your being. During this stage, you will not feel like you are growing up. On the contrary, sometimes you find yourself more fragile, more skeptical, more vulnerable, and sometimes even empty, because you are shedding every layer that once kept you attuned to the world. You no longer pretend to be okay. No more struggling to fit in. No more saying yes when inside you want to say no. And at that moment, you begin to be reborn. Not a dramatic rebirth like in a fairy tale, but a silent process, taking place in every breath, every small choice, every moment of silence that you bravely keep for yourself. The sacredness of isolation lies in this. You are no longer looking for consensus. You stop asking, "Do they understand me?" and start asking, "Am I being honest with myself?" Jung believed that everyone must go through their own inner darkness, facing the unrecognized, unintegrated parts. And to do that, we cannot carry the crowd, cannot carry expectations, cannot continue to live in the context of others. Sad isolation is when you stand alone, not because you are excluded, but because you choose to return. You choose to clear your inner space to hear your own voice again. You choose to disconnect, to reconnect the entity. You choose to accept being misunderstood, to keep the truth. Personalization is a journey without a destination, but with direction. That direction is not on any map, but within yourself. Each time you are more honest, more conscious, more coherent, you are moving. Every time you stop, turn inside, ask yourself the questions no one else dares to ask, you are moving. And in each silent step, you will gradually realize something very profound. Not everyone needs to understand you. Not everyone needs to stay. And not everyone who leaves is a loss. What you really need to keep is just the smoldering fire of your inner being. That fire, if you are patient enough to maintain it, will always lead the way. Not hasty, not dazzling, but persistent and faithful. Why is this process sacred? Because it brings you back to the one thing that cannot be borrowed from anyone. Real life doesn't need to be celebrated. It doesn't need to be applauded. It just needs to be lived. And if you are in that stage now, quiet, confused, sometimes doubting yourself, know that you are not lost. You are just being called back. You are entering the sacred zone of isolation, which all true beings must pass through before they can truly become themselves. We often think that self-control is expressed by actions, by strong words, by asserting ourselves in this noisy world. But sometimes, the deepest level of self-control lies in knowing when to retreat. Not to escape, but to retain a part that is gradually being lost, your true self. In a society that glorifies being present, always on time, always ready, always responsive, your choice to be absent can easily be misunderstood as indifference, coldness, or selfishness.
But Jung once said, "You cannot bring your true light to the world if you continue to live in the false light that others shine on you." Choosing to be absent in that spirit is not to turn your back on others, but to refuse to continue losing yourself in meaningless presences. Unconscious readiness is a form of self-abandonment. When you are always there for others without even asking if you really want it or not, you are gradually turning yourself into a social reflex, not a subject with free will. You are not the reply now button. You are not the default rescuer. You are not a wall that silently absorbs everyone else's emotions. Every time you are present, without coming from a place of self-presence, you are cutting yourself off from your inner center. That presence does not nourish you, nor does it nourish the relationship. It only silently exhausts you. It's no longer a connection. It's wear and tear wrapped in a decent wrapper. Why is choosing to be absent such a powerful act? Because, in an era where everyone is afraid of being forgotten, left behind, or misunderstood, the fact that you dare to stand still is a turning point. You dare to choose not to appear, not to respond, not to participate when it no longer suits your being. You don't just show up because you're afraid of being judged. Don't show up just to keep up the image. Don't answer just to avoid offending. You consciously withdraw. You stay silent not to create pressure, but to not get caught up in emotional waves that do not belong to you. It is an intentional choice, and a reaffirmation of your right to master your own life energy. When you begin to be selective in your presence, you will find that you begin to be respected, not by everyone, but by those who actually see you. Not an image, not a role, but yourself. A living being. Not born to serve, to keep the peace, to explain.
Choose to be absent is a silent declaration that my presence has value. And that value does not lie in how often I show up, but in how I choose to stay with what nourishes me. And then you suddenly realize you don't have to be everywhere. There's no need to appear in every conversation just to stay relevant. There's no need to respond to every signal just to avoid conflict. No need to chase every invitation, every story, every misunderstanding to maintain an image. Because your being is not in the image. Your being lives in the space you choose to return to, and in the things you dare choose to be silent about. Choosing to be absent is a way to protect yourself without hurting anyone. You don't need a sharp rejection. There is no need to erect defensive walls. You just need a silence that no longer carries fear. That silence says that I respect my life energy, and I will not let it be drained out of habit. That silence says, I respect my life energy, and I will not let it be drained by habit. Remember this gently. Your absence, if it comes from self-control and awareness, does not make you any less in anyone's eyes. It just makes you more visible. To yourself and to those alert enough to see it. Because true presence can only happen when, first of all, you are no longer absent from yourself. Not every ending requires a goodbye, and not every beginning requires a round of applause. Some journeys, including the journey back to being, begin with the quiet falling of shells that are no longer needed. Carl Jung never taught us to become someone great. He simply invites us back to what has always been there. The part of ourselves forgotten in the noise of the world and in the busyness of the self. There is a form of rebirth that does not require declaration. It doesn't come from winning something more, but from the moment you no longer want to compete. No longer feel the need to be faster, truer, stronger, just to prove that we still exist.
You don't need to start over. You just need to start being quiet. Be silent about things that no longer fit your breathing rhythm. Silence with conversations takes you away from yourself. Silence with the need to speak up all the time, as if only by reacting can you be considered alive. Rebirth is sometimes just a slow breath, a moment when you choose not to respond, a moment when you sit still, not to find answers, but to allow things to settle. No more resistance. No more trying to fix yourself to fit something out of your reach. no longer worrying about whether others understand, stay, or accept. In that stillness, on the surface, it seems like nothing is happening. But at that moment, something silently returned. Not a completely new version, but an old part that had been there, just buried for too long. Jung called it the unity of the ego and the self. When once separate parts begin to return to their original positions, when there is no longer a battle line between I should be and I am. Rebirth is no longer brilliant. It becomes clear. You don't suddenly become different. You just become more accurate. Fewer assumptions. Less explanation. Compromise less with what causes you to fall apart on the inside. You don't need to say anything to let others know you have changed. Your presence, more complete, more silent, is already the clearest affirmation. You may not be as prominent as before, but you have depth. You are no longer in a hurry to fill the void, but you can stay in that void without panicking. Silent rebirth is when you stop running out to search. You turn inward, not to judge, but to reclaim the parts of yourself that were once left behind. Seeing the adult who once carried the burden again. But this time, it wasn't to force him to carry more. You just looked and gently nodded. We've gone far enough. Now we just need to stay. Not everyone sees that rebirth, and it doesn't have to be. What is sacred does not need to be proven.
You may become more difficult to understand in the eyes of some people. You may lose some connections. You may no longer be the nice person you once were. You may become more difficult to understand in the eyes of some people. You may lose some connections. You may no longer be the pleasant person you once were. But you have become someone you can live with without having to run away. But in return, you become someone you can live with without running away. Jung once said, "You do not become enlightened by imagining the light, but by becoming familiar with the darkness." Perhaps that is all you have done on your recent journey, not to become someone else, but to no longer repeat yourself in the same old, tired, and predictable form. You are not a version of yourself designed to please everyone. You are a living presence, powerful enough to choose, alert enough to maintain your stillness in a world that constantly demands your response. And if you're wondering right now, have I really changed? You don't need an answer. And if you're wondering whether you've really changed, you don't need to answer. Just stay a little longer in this silence. Listen, and realize that silence has now become a part of you. A part that does not need to be recognized, only needs to be preserved, which is a quiet rebirth. And maybe it started a long time ago. Just stay a little longer in this silence. Listen, and realize that that silence has now become a part of you. A part that doesn't need to be acknowledged, just preserved. That is a quiet rebirth. And perhaps it started a long time ago. And if you're still here, in the silence of the end of this video, maybe you're no longer looking for anything outside. Just take a deep breath. Not to move on, not to rush. Just to stay a little longer with yourself. Thank you for accompanying us on a journey where there are no shortcuts, but there is always a way back. If you feel this video is useful, please like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to continue exploring with us the deepest levels of being and mind. See you in the next videos.